The honourable member for St. Paul's.
I would like to thank my leader for his passionate remarks and for his leadership on this very important issue for all Canadians.
When Kotler uses the phrase, the mobilization of shame, and the member from Mount Royal, and it is really what today's debate is about. We hope that every single Canadian, when they see those posters in the washrooms about washing your hands, what does it make someone feel like who doesn't even have running water to use with the soap to wash their hands? It makes me feel embarrassed as a Canadian, and I think what I found throughout my riding of St. Paul's and across this country wherever we go, all Canadians are increasingly embarrassed about the third world conditions in which so many of our First Peoples live. It is truly important to recall really what happened 2 years ago during H1N1, when it is not a coincidence that the communities that ended up on the list now of no running water were the very communities devastated by the impact of H1N1. But when you people in Canada come to know the names of St. Teresa Point, Garden Hill, Red Sucker Lake, Wasagamak, because those were the very communities with air transport taking their citizens out and so way too many of them not returning. It was in the first wave significant pressure on the air ambulances in the lessons learned, and 76 patients requiring air transfer from the northern communities. In 383 hospitalizations, 71 patients admitted to intensive care, and 11 deaths due to H1N1 flu in those northern Manitoba communities. Even though in the report on H1N1, First Nations communities in Manitoba and Northern Ontario have been hit by a highly communicable H1N1 virus. Despite being just 10% of the population in Manitoba, Natives made up a third of the 685 swine flu cases in that province. As our leader has said, still about 1,000 homes in northern Manitoba have still no running water, and many of these have no plumbing of any kind. During that time, we went to visit some of these communities, and I think all Canadians need to, in some way, be with us on that journey. To walk into a home and see where there ought to be a kitchen sink, a turquoise bowl filled with the water from last night's dishes, because they have no place to put that grey water, and they have to wait until the next water delivery comes. To go into that outhouse where these people have to use it all winter long is just inexcusable in a country as rich as Canada, and I don't think there's one Canadian who thinks that this should continue and that this isn't an urgent problem. When our government fell in 2005, we had just received the report of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Delivery, and I too, as others have said today, was in Cabinet during the embarrassment and tragedy of Kashechewan. We know we need to do more, and that, unfortunately, Madam Speaker, is 6 years ago. Since then, we've had the report on the expert panel on safe drinking water for First Nations. Since then, we've had the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Senate report, chaired by the Honourable Jerry Saint-Germain, a Conservative senator, which conclusion reached: legislation to regulate water standards on reserve is required. No one, including this committee, argues differently. Regulations are, however, only part of the answer. Sustained investment in the capacity of First Nation community water systems and those running the systems is absolutely essential to ensure First Nations people on reserve enjoy safe drinking water. Without this investment, we risk introducing a regulatory regime that burdens communities and does little to help them meet legislated standards. Unfortunately, this government has come forward with only an interest in legislation and no commitment for the resources to actually meet the standards that would be put forth in those regulations. We then, in 2008, had the devastating status report of the Auditor General of Canada in the House of Commons in Chapter 4, the Program for First Nations on Reserve. We then had the National Assessment on First Nations Water and Wastewater Systems, which, Madam Speaker, you will be appalled to learn, was available in April 2011, but was hidden by this government until after the election, because I think that they know that all Canadians would have been appalled. We then have the recent Waterproof 3, Canada's Drinking Water Report Card, in which the province of Ontario gets an A and the federal government gets an F. And as my colleague from Timmins James Bay has said, that this is again because the national standards don't seem to the kind of report carding for provinces stops at the border of the reserve. It says in that report that clean water isn't just an environmental issue. It's a health issue and a human rights issue. While the federal government now acknowledges the human right to water, they haven't taken any steps to make that a reality for the people who live in this country. This time last year, the Government of Canada signed the Declaration for Indigenous People where indeed that there is a responsibility on housing, sanitation, health and social security, and yet they've done nothing. In September, we wrote to the minister and asked him to do something and explained that we would not be able to support any legislation that did not come with it the resources that were necessary. I believe that we, having written today's motion, need to amend it. In talking with First Nations in the opposition, I now, Madam Speaker, wish to move, seconded by the member from Lac St. Louis, that the motion be amended by replacing the words "no later than the spring of 2012" with the word "forthwith." Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I must inform honourable members that an amendment.
It's my duty to inform the members that an amendment to an opposition motion may be moved only with the consent of the sponsor of the motion. Therefore, I ask the honourable member for Toronto Centre if he consents to this amendment being moved.
Yes. Yes, Madam Speaker.
This amendment is in order. Ms. Bennett moves, and seconded by the honourable member for Lac St. Louis, that the House call on the Government of Canada to address on an urgent basis the needs of those First Nations communities whose members have no access to clean running water in their homes, that action to address this disparity begin forthwith, and that the House further recognize that the absence of this basic requirement represents a continuing affront to our sense of justice and fairness as Canadians. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, I want to say at the outset how pleased I am that the Liberal Party has amended their motion. We in the New Democratic Party have been pushing for the issue of clean drinking water for many years, and the need to recognize that this is an immediate crisis, not that something that can be put off even days. At the present time, there is a state of emergency in the community of Attawapiskat. I visited last week with a doctor from the Winnebago Health Authority who says that these children and elders are now at immediate risk of life in the community from the lack of sanitation, children with open sores on their bodies from being exposed to toilet waste that's being dumped in ditches. I'd like to ask the member what she thinks about a situation where a government has money for all manner of priorities except for First Nation children. We see it in education, we see it in housing, we see it again and again, that the sense that there's two classes of people in this country, and that one class of First Nation children are continually considered non-entities. What does that say about our country? What does that say about the Parliament of Canada at this time?
Honourable Member for St. Paul's.
Thank you. I thank the member for his question, and can only respond by saying that I really am saddened by the fact that the Minister of Health has never visited any of these communities. That the Arctic is a very different place than these places on reserve. And during H1N1, there was no visits. That we need the leadership from the federal government. This is both. It affects many of the departments in the government. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs cannot do this on his own. This is First Nations Inuit Health Branch that also needs to provide some leadership on this, that it is a tragedy. And I urge the Minister of Health to go and visit these communities, particularly Attawapiskat, and be able to see for herself firsthand that what the action that must be taken by this government.
Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Montmagny, Lille, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. The honourable leader of the third party in this House has said that these issues are specifically federal. Now, my colleague has just talked about the situation in Kashechewan, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Based on research at the time, when water quality was poor and people had to be evacuated, the first reaction of the Liberal Party of the day, well, in fact, there was disagreement as to who was responsible, the provincial government or the federal government. So I'm interested and surprised to see the comments here today. How is this case different now in the view of the third party in this House? Why are they saying that the federal government should be taking action? Shouldn't they have taken action in the past? The honourable member for St. Paul's. Madam Speaker. I hope that this issue doesn't turn into a lesson. It is a priority for the future, not a history lesson. Kashechewan isn't in fact something that anyone can be proud of. It shows a situation where a community had been moved. There were issues with managing the drinking water system, and I hope that today all members in this House will agree with an urgent approach, an approach that needs to be acted upon today.